All right. We have, let's have another round of applause. Yeah. This has been super fun. We have a few more speakers, and then we can mingle and talk about saving the world. So, next up is Paul Steely White, who is the Executive Director of Transportation Alternatives. Let's have a big hand for him.
Hello, thank you, Eugene. Thank you. So Viraj talked about better food. I'm going to speak about better streets. Any non-native New Yorkers in the audience tonight? Most of you, maybe. I myself am from Rockford, Illinois. Nothing particularly special about Rockford. I came to New York sort of by accident in 1997. And one of the first things that really struck me was just how interesting the streets are here. I mean, everyone knows there's so much going on, but once you tune in, you realize that the suburb or empty downtown that you may have come from is very different. It's a very different experience than making eye contact all of the time with people or just being in close proximity to so many human beings and having so much opportunity for just spontaneous interaction and interesting things just happening all the time. And I love the streets here in New York, but they have been getting much better, I think, over the past few years. Really, they've been transformed in many ways. I've been lucky to be a part of that transformation. More public plazas, more pedestrian space, more bike lanes. And I think all of this is making a difference in some very obvious ways and also in some not so obvious ways. And that's what I hope to talk about during my brief time in front of you here this afternoon. There are 6,000 miles of streets in New York City. That's a lot of land area. I think it's helpful to think about the streets as also the space between buildings. If you add up all the space between our buildings in New York, it equals about 1/4 of the city's land area. And that's roughly equivalent to the borough of Brooklyn. So you can get a sense of just how potentially transformative the streets can be to a city. At Transportation Alternatives, we often try to be provocative if we can and show how streets could be used differently. In 2005, a few blocks from here, we did the first, what we called a parking spot squat, where instead of just having a steel machine stored there for a day, we took it over and we played chess and we parked bikes. And a month later, some of our colleagues in San Francisco did it even better, and they called it Parking Day, Park parenthetical ing day, and they put sod down and they had much more fun with it. And now you have this international movement every September where all over the world people are taking over parking spaces and showing everyone who walks by and many people who read about it in the media how great even just a little patch of city space can be if it were simply repurposed for people. Now this is happening in a very formal way in New York City. This is a pop-up cafe that our extraordinarily visionary transportation commissioner is doing now, Jeanette Sadik-Khan. You'll be seeing more of these. Bike lanes, of course, European-style cycle tracks on 8th and 9th Avenue, Prospect Park West, many other streets. Any bikers out there today? All right, I suspected this was a great crowd. Okay. Public plazas. This is Madison Square Park. It's formerly just kind of empty car space there in the middle. Now it's one of New York's most iconic public spaces where you can actually take a breath, look around, check out the architecture. And of course, public bike share coming to New York City, June, July next year, 10,000 bike. All right, not just a bike crowd, but an enthusiastic bike crowd. 10,000 bikes, 600 stations. I think it was recently negotiated that the footprint of the system will extend to Long Island City, certainly here. In phase 2, we hope to get 5-borough-wide bike share coverage. So what does all this do for us? Certainly it makes biking and walking much easier. And as you might suspect, it's very environmental. biking and walking, virtually zero emission, depending on what you eat, I suppose. But the benefits, the carbon savings, I think might have more to do, and there's data to support this, with making cities themselves more humane and habitable. We know that cities are inherently green. Just by living in New York, you're generating a third as much carbon as people who live elsewhere. Just because we share walls, we tend not to own cars, much less resource intense. So we know all this. But the unsung benefits of what you might term livable streets, I think were first espoused by this wonderful woman who you may have heard of. Who's this? Jane Jacobs, my hero, maybe your hero. She defended, really defined, I think, a whole movement of believing in cities. They're not these dirty, ugly places that you should escape from. Quite the contrary. They're the only places on earth where you can really realize your full potential because you're in this hive of activity. She talked about the ballet of the city sidewalks. She rode her bike every day from the West Village to her office in Times Square. She fought projects that would have put elevated expressways throughout Manhattan, through Soho, Chinatown, Little Italy, and Midtown. Our city would look like Houston today if it weren't for Jane. Uh-oh. Okay, there's Jane riding her bike. This is a block party this is a block party that are happening all over the city. So this flowering of public space is great for us Homo sapiens, us human beings. We need to walk. We need to see other people. These are things we have to do to be happy. I'll get to that in a moment. But people-oriented streets, as you might know, are much safer streets. All the streets that we have now with protected bike lanes, they're seeing 50% fewer injuries and fatalities to bikers, to be sure, but also to pedestrians and motorists. These streets really force everyone to pay more attention, and motorists are becoming accustomed to seeing bicyclists slowing down, taking slower turns. And so we're already seeing the dividends in terms of, I'm just going to stay over here, in terms of much lower pedestrian fatalities and injuries, and really across the board. So livable streets are safer streets for everyone. And we know that the more people ride, the fewer crashes there are. Bikers have this natural traffic calming effect, city after city has discovered. People always get a kick out of this. So, there's an obesity epidemic, certainly where I'm from in the Midwest, maybe less so here in New York, where we tend to walk a bit more. But, people talk about exercising, and doctors have been telling people to go to the gym for years, and it doesn't really do anything. If anything, it's gotten worse. The only thing that really works is designing streets so that people get activity as part of their everyday life. Walking to the store, riding their bike to the doctor, or hopefully not, to see a friend. And we know that in cities and countries where there is high instances of cycling, there's also very low rates of obesity, and this relationship is very strong, and it holds true throughout the world. We're seeing it happening in New York already. I mentioned happiness a little bit a few minutes ago, and there's a great book coming out next year called The Happy City by Charles Montgomery, and he's looked at cities around the world and how street transformations have actually had a measurable impact on depression rates and on changing people's whole outlook on their city and even on humanity. And you see this time and again when streets are re-engineered for people. There's something really magical that happens there. We did a survey a few years ago, and we found that if you live on a high-traffic street versus a low-traffic street, if you live on a high-traffic street, you have fewer friends. You don't know your neighbors. You don't even know the people who live across from you. Your street's noisy. It's dirty. You spend more time inside. Your kids don't play as often. you have a measurably lower quality of life. We've found that streets that are engineered for people are much better for business, which is really great because we're going into this election in a few years. Remember that guy, Anthony Weiner? He famously said that he's going to rip out all the fucking bike lanes if he were elected, and a few of the pedestrian plazas too. I find it actually quite pleasing that he got his comeuppance another way. But you know, it's going to be a challenge to show that these kinds of people-oriented streets really matter to business in our economy, and they do. So you're going to be seeing more studies linking walking and biking to local neighborhood retail, small businesses. Most small business owners think everyone drives to their store, and survey after survey shows only about 6% of New Yorkers are driving to shop. The rest are walking and increasingly biking. Finally, I want to talk about a new frontier in this realm of livable streets or people-oriented urban planning that some researchers are starting to tune into, and that is the relationship between less car-centric streets and what we might know as democracy, or what we used to know as democracy. Streets that are for cars don't have a lot of room for the kinds of regular, everyday human interactions that really, I think, feed a healthy democracy. I mean, when you think about Occupy Wall Street or other kinds of street protests, absolutely, sure, you need that public space. But I think there's also something very valuable about just talking politics with your neighbor because your street allows you to do that. Or walking to the farmer's market and signing a petition. These are the fine-grained ways in which we knit together, you know, local communities and ultimately figure things out, not just tuning into TV to do that. And what's happened in our city is largely because of this spatial dividend, where getting people out of their cars and on to the street, there's 50 New Yorkers traveling in each of these photographs. So you can see that when people are taking the bus or riding their bikes or walking, there's actually space for the agora. That's what the Greeks called it, the public space platform where public discourse actually takes place. This is my last slide. Was my last slide. You remember what it looked like, right? That was Times Square. As cool Brooklynites, we probably don't go to Times Square very often because it's so commercial and it's so crowded and there's so many dumb tourists there. My parents are in town this week, and we were in Times Square just today, actually. And there was something happening there that wasn't happening a couple of years. I mean, clearly you can walk there now. I mean, that's clearly happening now without getting killed. But there's a lot more seeing and being seen, checking out, spontaneous interactions. Oh, will you take my picture? Oh, sure, let me take your, you know, there's just all this real magic of the street happening, this interaction and transaction that really cities were created for in the first place. And it's a very happy thought to me that Times Square is one of the world's leading tourist attractions, right? People go there very intentionally. And what they're seeing is this resurgence, this renaissance of the public sphere. And I find that just very gratifying. It also makes me very optimistic for the future because something happened 2 years ago. Homo sapiens became a fully urban species for the first time. There's more of us living in cities now than not. And that's the first time that's ever happened in the history of our evolution. And it's going to be more urban in the future, as has been discussed here today. So what happens on our city streets, what happens in our cities is going to really determine, I think, to a large degree, how healthy we are, how happy we are, how vibrant our democracy is, and whether or not we can simply ride our bike to the farmer's market. So if you're interested in any of this, I encourage you to get involved. There's a lot happening right now on the streets of New York, at the community board level, at the city level, because there's people who don't want this to happen, but I think we're going to win this. So please get involved with transportation alternatives if you can. Thank you very much.